Thank you very much. Thank you to University of Dallas for having me. Thank all of you for coming. Thank you to Dr. Hansen for getting me from the airport and helping to bring in a crowd here. So I'm going to give you a talk that's going to talk both about things as high as Aristotle and Homer and as low as American politics. But what I'm aiming at is something that is along the lines of talking about natural law and human nature and the common good and, frankly, what the good life is. And the reference to the struggles in the working class today has to do with a lot of people who lack access to the good life in a very specific, very American way. So in other words, I wrote a book about the death of the American dream. Or more precise, the view held by many people that the American dream is dead. So it's a story about work. It's a story about family. It's a story about community. It's a story about faith. But if you'll pardon me, in the very beginning, it's also a story about politics, specifically how Donald Trump came to be the President of the United States, this very unlikely man. And because I am a political reporter is my job, it's a story that begins in Iowa. And because I am an Irish Catholic, it is a story that begins in a bar. Joe's Place in Iowa City is right outside of the university there. And I met a couple that worked at the university. And the lady told me that she was from Orange City, Iowa. Now, you guys remember, Iowa is first in the nation caucuses, so you travel all over the whole state. But I'd never been to Orange City. And so I'm a guy from New York City, lives in the Washington, D.C. area. So a lot of parts of, like, middle America were kind of foreign to me. So I said, why is it called Orange City? And she said, well, it has to do with our Dutch heritage. And I said, so exactly how Dutch is Orange City? And she said, this woman whose name was Holly Vander something said, let me put it this way. We used to march in our wooden clogs past the windmills for the Tulip Festival. And this wasn't in Netherlands. This was in Iowa. Windmill Square is literally the center of town. The Welcome to Orange City sign is in the shape of a wooden clog. Like, this place actually really exists. And I was wondering, how is there this island of Dutchness in this corner of Iowa that I'd never heard of? And again, I'm an Irish guy. New York, we think about ethnicity a lot. So I was so intrigued, I traveled out to Orange City. And I found a couple things. One of them was that at this Jeb Bush rally I found, there's one pastor who said he had 900 people in his pews. And in the Republican caucuses, and I'm just going to make a quick note here. When I'm talking about politics, I'm not talking about should Donald Trump be impeached or Trump versus Hillary or any of that stuff. I'm talking about the people who never voted before and then would stand in line for 4 hours for an event, or for Donald Trump, or never voted before and then went ahead and voted in a Republican primary for Trump over these 16 other candidates. The people who came out of the woodwork to support this guy. But guess what? None of them were in Orange City. This guy said 900 people in my pews. One of them is supporting Trump in the primaries. The others were Ted Cruz, Rubio, more people who seem more traditionally conservative, especially for a religious conservative crowd. The other thing is, yes, it was very Dutch in Orange City. That's, again, this is not Netherlands, this is Iowa. So that county that it's in, Sioux County, had Trump's lowest percentage in the whole caucuses. He would carry it in the general because they're conservative and they voted for him over Hillary. But in those caucuses, he only got 11%. And this is the Dutchest county in all of America. You'd be shocked if there were any place more Dutch. But it was also Trump's worst county in the caucuses. So there was something going on here. Again, as a political analyst, you talk about a Hispanic vote or a Catholic vote or an evangelical vote. Apparently there was a Dutch vote. And I needed to figure out what this was just to make sure it was a real thing. I looked at Michigan. Michigan over here, Holland, Michigan is right there to give you an idea. This is the Dutch part of Michigan. All of those counties are at least 25% report Dutch ancestry as their main ancestry. The red counties are the counties that Trump won in the primaries. And the other counties are, the orangish ones are the ones that Cruz won. So again, why was this a thing? I asked Ted Cruz, I said, why are you winning all these Dutch places? You dominated in Orange City in Sioux County, Iowa. You dominated in Western Michigan. And he said, Tim, Dutch people, they're really nice. And they want a nice guy. Donald's not nice. They want to vote for a nice guy. And I thought, nice guy like Ted Cruz? What? Somebody else had a theory that the Dutch were upset at Trump for appropriating the color orange. I did not buy that. Something else was going on. So I headed out. So there was one answer kind of given by a guy out in Iowa, in Sioux County. He was a husband of a professor. And he was a liberal, but he said, oh, in this place, everybody votes right, but they live left. And I thought I was suddenly onto some sort of scandal out there in the middle of Iowa. But he said, no, out here, everybody's really conservative, but they take care of their neighbors and they look out for the whole town. And I got really annoyed. I thought, that's not living left. Conservatives are just as likely to do that. But I understood exactly what he meant. He meant that it wasn't like rapacious capitalism and everybody for himself. That was his idea of a conservative. What he meant is that there was real strong social trust, very intense social cohesion, and a very strong sense of duty for one's neighbor, particularly one in need. And that's, again, what I found out in Holland, Michigan, and Grand Rapids. So finally, Wisconsin's coming up. I find a very Dutch town in Wisconsin called Oostburg. I go up to Oostburg trying to crack this Dutch thing that's going on, and I see very clearly what should have been obvious from the beginning. I sit down at the counter at Judy's Diner, but it's Sunday morning, and in comes all the families from the 9 a.m. services at the First Reformed Church, and the Bethel Orthodox Presbyterian Church, the 9:15 at First Presbyterian Church, and the 9:30 services at First Christian Reformed Church. This is in a village of 2,000, and that's not all the churches. That's all the churches that fit in the tradition of Reformed Christianity, sort of tied to Calvinism. 4 churches in a village of 2,000, and they're packed. And one of the complaints one of the people at the diner counter gave me was, he sends his kids to the public school, and he said, I tried to go to the Christmas concert here, and the seats were all full, and a third of the parents didn't even send their kids to the public school, and they were taking up my seats. And I said, Jamie, why are you taking up my seat? And the guy said, hey, we got to see our kids. And again, this was a parent whose kids didn't go to the public school, but the kids of the village of Oostburg were widely seen as our kids. If you guys have lived in a close, tight-knit community, you've also encountered that idea. So that was present. And the cause of this was the churches. These Dutch communities, what made them so strong were the churches, the Christian schools. So what had happened was these Reformed churches had planted themselves across Middle America in little clusters, not evenly, little clusters, Western Michigan, Sioux County, Iowa, Oostburg, Wisconsin. They formed hardy, robust, tightly knit communities that avoided the afflictions of so much of rural America, such as inequality, the retreat from marriage, out of wedlock births, and drug abuse and other deaths of despair. And of course, it wasn't just the Dutch. The Mormons, again, back to politics for a moment, Trump's second worst state was Utah. Very high religiosity and very good outcomes as far as family formation, finishing high school, staying in the workforce, etc. And then I saw it closer to home. Here's Silver Spring, part of Silver Spring, Maryland. So you see Trump won all of Silver Spring except for the part that's on the map. That's in the Republican primaries. So this road here is called Arcola Avenue, and there is a Orthodox synagogue there. And then this road here is called Kemp Mill Road, and up at the top there's another Orthodox synagogue, plus about 4 other Jewish institutions. Orthodox Jews tend to observe the rule that you do not operate machinery on the Sabbath. So you have to be able to walk to church, so to speak. So those 2 precincts are packed with people. It's not just that they're religious, it's that they live in tight communities where people are looking after their kids, they have all these institutions, and those were the 2 precincts in Silver Spring that Ted Cruz won. So there's definitely something going on there. Now, it's interesting to live there if you are a Catholic family with 6 children. And in most audiences, you don't have to say only 6 children, but with only 6 kids. No, but you walk into a grocery store in Silver Spring with 6 kids, and they point you to the kosher foods aisle immediately. You walk into a grocery store in Chevy Chase, Maryland, kind of Tony with 6 kids, and they point you to the family planning aisle. So this is one reason why we live here in, so speaking of Chevy Chase, that's a country club. That's not somebody's house, but the houses don't look that different. So Chevy Chase is very different from Oostburg, Wisconsin in a lot of ways. But in other ways, it's very similar. Village of about 2,000. And it ended up, Trump got 15% in Oostburg in the primaries. He got 15% in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Now, there are robust churches there. Brett Kavanaugh attends Blessed Sacrament, and the pews are very full there. But the defining trait of Chevy Chase is not the churches. It's the wealth. But it's not just the wealth. 66% of the people in Chevy Chase, of the adults, have graduate degrees. Okay? Keep in mind, about 25%, maybe it's a little more, about a third or less of the U.S. population has even a college degree. So to have 66% have advanced degrees, highly educated, highly wealthy. The average home in Chevy Chase costs 10 times the average home in Oostburg. And this was a kind of place that Trump also bombed in the primaries. I talked about Western Michigan. This is Grosse Pointe, Michigan. This is, wealthy part. Trump did very poorly there, as well as in Ann Arbor and the highly educated places. Iowa actually has a couple of the most educated counties in America, and those were two of Trump's worst. So this chart up here, it's hard to see, but these are the counties where in the primaries Trump got 20% or less. Most of those up there are Mormon counties in Utah or Idaho. The reddish, pinkish ones are the Dutch counties in Michigan and Iowa. You'll also see up there some college counties. Arlington County, Virginia, the most educated county in the country, is up there, plus some Iowa counties. So it seems like two types of places, right? The places that are rejecting this. And I said, I think this is one type of place. The wealthy and educated on one hand, and the religious conservatives on the other. Chevy Chase and Oostburg. What are they? These places that vote against Trump, it's because the most important thing Trump said was the American dream is dead. He came down the escalator, announced his candidacy, he said the American dream is dead. And so much of the country agreed with him, except in these two types of places. The wealthy elites, and people say, oh, well, the dream is alive for them, but also religious conservatives. So part of what I think my St. John's education taught me to do is if you see something that looks like two different phenomena, you try to explain it as one, right? This is what Isaac Newton did. He said, both apples fall from trees and the earth goes around the sun. Maybe that's not two different phenomena. Maybe that's one phenomenon. I think this is one phenomenon. The American dream seems alive in places with strong institutions of civil society that bring people together. Strong communities, institutions that give people a sense of purpose, that give people a human level safety net, and that make it possible to either raise a family or pursue whatever else it is that makes a good life a good life. And so I want to quickly talk again about the wealthy places. There are some conservative Catholic friends I have who assume that what goes on in Chevy Chase is like I call it the Lena Dunham fallacy, but that's getting to be a dated reference at this point. A lot of people assume that the wealthy liberals all graduate from Wesleyan College and they leave, and the women decide that marriage is an outdated institution and they don't need to do it. There's this idea of wealthy liberal people as decadents. Chevy Chase, Maryland, 95% of the children in Chevy Chase, Maryland are being raised by married parents. In general, if you go to the zip codes with really high incomes and high educational attainment, you will find them practicing what I, as a conservative Catholic, am preaching, which is finishing school, getting married, having kids, staying involved in your kid's life, and staying involved in the community. So those are the types of places, whether it's because of the Reformed Church or because of the perception by a lot of the elites that this is a path to a good life. Those are the places where the American dream is most alive. What happens where it's dead? Now, one thing I should, I guess I'll say this. What does community do? What is the value? So this is marriage. So what I did, a lot of people, when we do talk about the retreat from marriage, people are getting married less. One reason is that college-educated people are getting married later. Women are more likely to get college and advanced degrees. But that's really that shows up in statistics if you look at who's married or who's married at age 30 or whatever. So what I did is I said, women at age 40, how many of them are married? So that takes into account two things. One, most of the delay of marriage among the highly educated still shows up as married here. And divorce, though, also shows up as not married here. And so what you see is a general drop-off, all three lines. That's college educated is red, some college is green, and only high school is blue as far as your education level. Everybody's less likely to be married today than they were earlier. But there was no difference among the classes in 1960 as to whether you were likely to be married. Now, over 2/3 of college-educated women are married at age 40, and only half of those who never went to college are married at age 40. So that, I argue, is one of the main things that community does. A wise woman once said, "It takes a village to raise a child." That was the title of Hillary Clinton's book, and who knows what she meant by it. She probably meant that they want to kidnap our kids and put them through like government camp or whatever. But she was right, insofar as you cannot raise children with as just two parents. This, it sort of happens a little bit in Little House on the Prairie, but they really actually start to thrive once they live in a real community. That parents need all sorts of help. You need modeling. You need people to watch your kids just so that you can step out. You need people to watch your kids so that they can run around the neighborhood without you keeping an eye on them. You need people to tell you, actually, no, we tried that didn't really work. You need people to be role models. You need to see kids, and a lot of them end up here at University of Dallas, the ones that I see, who, when they're 17, I'm like, that kid actually turned out okay, so maybe my kids are going to turn out okay. And so all of that, so one of the main things that community does is provide the infrastructure to raise a family. And related to that, but not just about family, is the safety net. This is my daughter, Eve. Had real trouble breathing, had a cold. Now, one of the things most parents don't admit is when your kid is a little bit sick when they're about 1 and they just started to learn to walk, it's sort of nice because they start cuddling to you like they haven't in a while. And so Eve was doing that, but then she started getting worse. And this was on a Sunday morning again. And we had done what we call the divide and conquer. I went to Mass with most of the kids at 8:30, and then I came home, and I'm holding Eve. My wife's at Mass with our oldest, and I look at Eve, I'm like, this is really bad. And I've got a thing to check the blood oxygen content, and it was way too low. Katie has the car, I'm calling. Of course, your phone is not on during Mass, so she's not answering. And so I'm sprinting down Georgia Avenue with Eve in a double stroller, eventually emergency room, and then children's hospital, and they get her hooked up to wall oxygen, just so that nobody worries. She's perfectly fine. That's her 4 days later. But while we're in the hospital, hooked up to the wall oxygen, Katie and I, one of us always wanted to be there, but that meant we had to tag in and out. So that means we're leaving 5 kids at home. And it meant that the carpool we couldn't really pull off. What happened in those 5 days was an experience that hadn't happened to us, but all of our friends said that basically a similar thing happened. Let me put it this way. At the end of it, we had so much leftover food, we were afraid it was going to go bad. When my son read the intro to the book, which tells this story, he said, "You should have included the part about the lunch." I said, "What do you mean the part about the lunch?" He said, "Well, I would bring these corner bakery sandwiches to school, and for that 1 week, we had the best lunch at school." For that 1 week, yes. So I'm the guy who makes the lunch every other day. And so the support we got was so thorough, and we were able to not have to leave any kids alone there. You go around the pediatric intensive care unit in a hospital like that, there's a lot of kids who are alone. And it's not because of parents. I don't choose to think it's because the parents don't care about them. It's because often there's one parent at home, and that parent is working 2 jobs to take care of them. Intact marriages with a community support provide a local level, human level safety net that we need that would cost, hundreds of thousands of dollars to replace. There's more about what community does. One is upward mobility. So Raj Chetty is an economist, and he saw that a lot of people say upward mobility is over in the United States, but it's actually not true. Poor people are just as likely to get rich. people are just as almost as likely to do better than their parents than they used to be. But that's not true across the board. There are some places with robust upward mobility. Utah is one of them. There are some places with not very much. And so he went and looked on a local level, Raj Chetty, this economist, and he thought that something like more teachers per student in the classroom would indicate it. More educational spending. No. He thought maybe the places with less upward mobility are the places that had factories and the people there sort of collapsed. He found that didn't really predict mobility so much. So 3 things that did. This one's really interesting, and I haven't dug into it too much. Teenage labor force participation. I think it's because intact families with strong communities are more likely to be able to send their 15, 16-year-olds out to find a summer job or something like, or a job after school. Various measures of social capital. That's a word social scientists use to mean kind of what I've been talking about here. What we were doing when Eve was in the hospital was drawing on our reserves of social capital. There were people who would do stuff for us because we were connected to them through institutions. Not that we had done something for them, but they had gotten something else out of the parish. Because all those people who brought us stuff, they weren't just friends. They were people who were friends from our parish, friends from our swimming pool, friends from the girls' school where our daughters go, the boys' school. They were friends from work. There was always an institution that connected us. So the best way to acquire what social scientists call social capital is to belong to things. And it can be Chevy Chase Country Club, or it can be the First Christian Reformed Church in Oostburg. In Oostburg. But intact families in the communities was a #1 predictor of upward mobility. So it wasn't even, are you being raised by 2 parents? It was, are the kids in your neighborhood generally being raised by 2 parents? Those were the people who were most likely to accomplish the version of the American dream that is doing better than your parents, climbing up the economic ladder. So that's what community does. What happens in the places where it's dead? So, quick aside, I'm a reporter, and I do what, as I've already referred to, what some of my colleagues call bar reporting. Bar reporting is where you go to a bar and you sit and listen to people until they start talking to you about politics. But you can't do it at any bar. You go to a college bar, frankly, most of them don't vote. Half of them are out of state. You go to a hotel bar, they're all from out of state. I found yuppie Irish pubs was the best because you had Democrats and Republicans and women and men and old and young, and so that's where I went most cycles. A place I was skipping was what I called roadside country bars. And these are the kinds of places that your parents would definitely tell you not to go into. There's no like nice parking lot with paved lines or even a curb cutout. You drive from the street onto gravel. There's no windows in the front because if you're inside, you don't want to be seen, presumably. But I would go in there. But when I went in there in 04, 08 cycles, the 2004, 2008 elections, people would say, politics is a bunch of BS and I don't vote. And that's basically, so the conversation would end. So I stopped going. 2016, I had to start going again, and the same bars, same people would say, politics is a bunch of BS, that's why I'm voting for Donald Trump. So one specific bar I went to down in Fayette County, south of Pittsburgh. Uniontown, the biggest city in Fayette County, used to be a robust, bustling town driven by the economy of the steel mills and the coal industry. Dozens of Catholic parishes, dozens of Protestant churches, little leagues, community leaders who were very successful businessmen, building up the downtown. Now it's nothing like that. It's making a little bit of a rebound as sort of a hipster place to live an hour outside of Pittsburgh, but it hasn't been doing very well. How did I end up in Fayette County? I found some graduate student who had done a study on church attendance and religious adherence by county, by denomination and religion, and Fayette was one of the biggest drop-offs in Catholic church attendance and evangelical attendance or adherence. In other words, I went to the place where the people were turning away from church the most. And I went into Smitty's, a bar there, and I asked about the economy. It's one of the top 2 on people taking unemployment insurance and men taking disability insurance. One thing to realize about disability insurance, it people claiming disability insurance goes up when the economy gets worse, meaning part of going on disability is sort of a sense of there's not a good job out there for me. And some people think it's just people cheating the economy, but really I think a lot of it has to do with depression and that sort of thing. So I'm at Smitty's, and the politics was what you would expect. Every single person in the bar is voting for Trump, and when you ask them about policies, they say guns, and everybody in the bar is white, even though Uniontown is very diverse. And I asked them about the economy, and they say two things that contradict each other. They say there's no jobs, and then they say nobody here actually works when they're given a job. And then they start talking about how lazy all their neighbors are. Oh, well, there's people on disability who could totally work. There's people on unemployment who are going to wait till it runs out and then find a job. People on food stamps who sell the food stamps and then use money to buy drugs, which then they sell, and all of these stories. And then some of these food stamp stories you actually hear, they're always third hand, and they're in the same bar in different parts of the country. Oh, this woman, my neighbor saw this woman going up, and she was going to buy dog food with her food stamps. And when they said, you can't buy dog food with food stamps, she grabbed a T-bone steak and said, Rufus is going to eat well tonight. And I'd heard that story in third hand in many different bars. And all these guys complaining about the unworking people in their county on 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in Smitty's. And I was in the bar at 2:30, but it was my job to be in the bar at 2:30. But anyway, I turned to one guy, Dave. I remember exactly where he was sitting. I said, Dave, why don't you work? And he says, well, my back. And this excruciating story about excruciating back surgeries. And I say, so all the jobs around here that are left are manual labor. And he says, no, there's office jobs, but I can't sit at a desk for 30 minutes. I said, Dave, you've been sitting at the bar stool for about 90 minutes. But that's when he looks at me and he says, Tim, I'm numb today because my son died this morning. And I knew the numbers. I knew that Fayette County had through the roof opioid overdose. That's part of what I was looking at. But I had sort of never processed it until I was looking in the face of this depression. This man who had given up drinking for 10 years until this day was dragged back into this place with no windows out front because he didn't want to be seen. And that's when you realize something has gone terribly wrong with the way so much of our country is living. The people outside of the places I talked about in the beginning, it's not just they stopped going to church and they have some other way of living. They stopped going to church, they stopped knowing their neighbors, and things fell apart. And the death and the suicide and the drugs and the retreat from marriage are the symptoms. And so that is what takes us there, is a collapse of these community institutions. So what are the root causes of the collapse of the community institutions? Well, there's a notion Tocqueville puts forward, and that probably predates him, but that's where I know it from, that there's two things that sound the opposite, but are two sides of the same coin: a hyper-individualism and an over-centralization. My colleague at AEI, Yuval Levin, sums it up nicely. Collectivism and atomism are not opposite ends of the political spectrum, but they're two sides of one coin. They are closely related tendencies, and they often coexist to reinforce one another, making the other possible. This is what Tocqueville predicted about America, was that an individualism would lead to and be caused by, so the causality goes both ways, an overbearing central state. That is, that our bonds with our horizontal bonds with the people around us would be disintegrated as our bonds with the central state is stronger. But I don't want to talk about just the two-dimensional thing. It's the hubs of the community things, the things that were helping us when Eve was in the hospital. When those erode, we lose our connection to our fellow man, and we become more connected to the central state. So one thing that economists have studied is called crowding out. That is, government spending has driven out charitable spending. And this one economist did a study where he looked at, during the New Deal, there were some congressmen who had the ability to earmark, to spend money just back home. And he found that where the powerful congressmen were, that's where church giving and charitable spending collapsed the most. So it's not a dollar for dollar. When the government steps in, often there's more money for the poor than before the government came. That's true. The crowding out isn't crowding out. It's bringing in $100, and so church spending goes down by 30. So if all you care about is money getting to the poor people, the New Deal, the Great Society, big government spending is good. But that can't be all you care about. Because if what the crowding out does is weaken and destroy the institutions of civil society, specifically the churches, that's how you go from being like Oostburg to being like Uniontown. Another version of overcentralization is mass media. Our attention is overcentralized now. More people know the names of multiple lawyers of Donald Trump than know their mayor, their county executive, anything like that. We pay attention to the things that affect us less, and more importantly, that we have less effect over, at the expense of the things that could affect us more, and that certainly we have the ability to affect. But also the flip side of it is hyper-individualism. One is technology. It's very easy to ignore everybody around you, and you can just stare into your phone like this. Two, you can curate your own lifestyle so that you don't have overlapping cultural stuff with your neighbors. There's 800 new shows, and the ability to watch any channel, to basically create your own channel, to do anything like that takes away our common shared experience. I think the biggest impact of a hyper-individualism, though, has been through the sexual revolution. Marriage used to be a permanent thing, entered into in front of a community. The idea of marriage as a bilateral bond, I suppose I think of it as a modern thing, but in my assignment from Dr. Hansen, I'm realizing it comes from John Locke. But marriage as a bilateral bond engaged in, like you going to the corner store to buy a candy bar, of just exchange, just a transaction. Well, we both benefit, so let's do that. That's a modern idea, which is not a community-based idea, and it's a transactional idea, which is not a relational idea. And that's another part of both hyper-individualism and over-centralization. Things become transactions instead of relations. One sociologist, Anthony Giddens, said, who's a leftist in England, said that dating and sexual relationships had become something, quote, entered into for its own sake, for what can be derived by each person, and which is continued only insofar as thought by both parties to deliver enough satisfactions. Two sides of the same coin, perfectly embodied in an old artifact of American politics from 2012 called The Life of Julia. Now, some of you will remember this, not the students probably. So Barack Obama came up with this slideshow that was supposed to say how the life of this young woman was so much better from cradle to grave because of federal programs Barack Obama created. And it was very telling. So this is young Julia. I'll read it. Under President Obama, Julia is enrolled in a Head Start program. Mitt Romney would cut it. And so it's this girl alone in her bedroom. High school. Under President Obama, Julia takes the SAT and is on track to start her college applications. Her high school is part of the Race to the Top program. Mitt Romney would cut it. And you're like, wait, there's only one girl in that high school. College. Graduation. I guess she's a valedictorian? I don't know. Then, under President Obama, Julia decides to have a child. Whoa, there was no other people here. So they have their own teaching of, a virgin birth, I guess, under President Obama. But this is a slide about how the contraceptive mandate, forcing nuns and universities to provide contraception, helps Julia. And then maternity checkups and that sort of thing. So it's a perfect blending of over-centralization and hyper-individualism. She doesn't need anybody else because she has a federal government. But part of the reason I picked this slideshow is because combining those two things, hyper-individualism and over-centralization, the biggest threat is secularization. And secularization doesn't mean opposing all religion. Here I mean it to mean driving religion out of the public square. And so that's particularly harmful because 50% of all civic activity in the United States begins in the church. Robert Putnam wrote a book 20 years ago called Bowling Alone about how we don't have as many bowling leagues, we don't have as many Kiwanis clubs, etc. He dedicated one chapter where in one sentence he said, oh yeah, and the civic activity I'm talking about, these civic organizations that people are dropping out of, half of them are church related. And then he kind of moved on. It was a little uncomfortable. He did write a follow-up with a Mormon from Notre Dame called American Grace. Very big. It didn't sell as well, but it was an amazing source of information. The fundamental institution of civil society in the United States is and always has been the church. And so when those churches start closing, that's what leads to the plague of alienation. That's what leads to the sufferings of the working class in middle America. Plague of alienation is a plague of secularization in America because there's this effort to drive religion out of the public square. This was back in 2012 when those contraception mandate fights were starting. A liberal writer wrote, I'm tired of religious groups operating secular enterprises, such as hospitals and schools, hiring people of multiple faiths, serving the general public, taking taxpayer dollars, and then claiming that deeply held religious beliefs should exempt them from public policy. Now, the irony is the closest thing he had to a strong argument was taking taxpayer dollars, and that wasn't true at all in the Hobby Lobby fight, obviously. Hobby Lobby was the craft store that was getting forced to provide the contraceptives they didn't want to provide. But he's saying that once you serve the general public, once you step out there, then you're no longer allowed to claim that your religious beliefs matter. Then there's this guy, Texan, good Irishman, Robert Francis O'Rourke. After saying he would tax churches that don't conduct gay marriages, he clarified. He said, the way you practice your religion or faith within that mosque or temple or synagogue or church, that's your business and not the government's business. Thank you, Beto. But when you are providing services in the public sphere, say higher education or healthcare or adoption services, and you discriminate or deny equal treatment under the law based on someone's skin color or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation, then we have a problem. So, posit a church that discriminates on the basis of gender, say, in the priesthood. Well, you've got a problem. Posit a school, a girls' school that tries to hire only female teachers, or a girls' school that wants to compete only against female athletes who are biologically female. Well, then you've got a problem. Posit a mosque that doesn't want to conduct gay marriages or doesn't want to rent out its community hall to a gay marriage reception. Well, you've got a problem with the federal government under this mindset of secularization. So, and it goes deeper than that. Barack Obama regularly spoke of the freedom of worship, which are not words in the Constitution. The words in the Constitution are free exercise of religion. And that's important because I belong to a faith, and this school is attached to a faith, where the exercise of our religion requires us to go out into the community and do those things that we're told we cannot do if we're going to do them according to our belief. Love your neighbor. And love your neighbor is a very important thing to talk about here as I wrap up, because the Good Samaritan story is a story where the neighbor is actually a foreigner, but who's a Good Samaritan? He's the man who is physically proximate to the person suffering. Loving your neighbor, I think, the way I read this passage, because Jesus says, love your neighbor, and the guy says, who is my neighbor? And that's when he tells a Good Samaritan story. It is a physically proximate being that's your neighbor. And it might be somebody who speaks a different language, has a different religion, is different in so many other ways. But the need to love the people who are near you is what we are required to do as Christians. And the loss of the neighborly love is at the root of the collapse of those places in middle America. So I've got solutions that I'm going to skip over because solutions is not my strong point. I'm going to come home in the end. So I showed you Arcola Avenue and Kent Mill Road. At the intersection of Arcola and Kent Mill is St. Andrew Apostle Catholic Church. That's my parish. I love the parish. In some ways, it's nothing special. In some ways, it's sort of a magical little place. None of us can actually walk to it because it's much more valuable if you're Jewish to walk to your synagogue than if you're Catholic to walk to your parish. So there's all sorts of issues with our parish. We have some people who live in our parish and don't go because it's not Latin enough or the music isn't beautiful enough. But I absolutely love St. Andrews. If you come to St. Andrews, there's a baseball backstop, and if you look behind it, there's a little plaque that says DeTolli's Diamond. And if you look out over the field, it says Terrence E. McCardle Playing Field. And it always struck me that we have those signs at St. Andrews because it's different from the way a lot of things go. I picked a Dallas thing, the Perot Museum of Nature and Science. So the Perot family named lots of money, helped build up this museum, and named it after him. If you have lots of money, you should do stuff like this. You should build up institutions of civil society, colleges, schools, parks, museums, things that bring people together, educate them. Boy Scout troops and Cub Scout troops and Girl Scout troops all meet at this museum, and that's a great thing to do if you have a lot of money. But not everybody has that Perot level of money. So the other slide there is a St. Andrew Apostle girls basketball team. This was 40 seconds left in the game. They're subbing back in the 5 girls who had been on the team for 3 straight years and so had lost 26 consecutive basketball games and were about to win one game there. The one all the way over on the right, number 33, Larry Bird's number, that's my daughter. But zoom in on the back of number 7, Al Weaver, 50 years of athletics, St. Andrew Apostle. So Al Weaver, Mike DeTolli, Terrence McCardle never gave a dime more than the average money you put in the basket. What did they do? They coached t-ball. They coached football. They coached basketball. They were the ushers. They were the people who taught Sunday school. So why do I bring this up? Centralization is a big part of the problem. So you can't have a big solution to the problem of alienation. You can't create a federal department of community cohesion. So there is no one big solution. There's tens of thousands, there's thousands of institutions of civil society or millions of people who are going to decide, okay, I'm not going to be a Ross Perot or whatever, but I can be an Al Weaver. I can be the lady who's been the extraordinary minister for 30 years. They can be the woman who runs the choir while her husband is in charge, is a policeman full-time, and she's also a school teacher. And when I say they, I mean you people. This is sort of where I end, is because I got to the end of this book and I had no bill to pass or whatever. I said, I hope everybody who picks up this book, when they put it down and they look around the world, they see things differently. Because for so many of you, especially if you're in college, this was the air you breathed. This community, the swimming pools, the high schools, whether it's a public school that the parents were actually involved in, or whether it's a parish or some other organization, your success is because you were plugged into these hubs. And so the way to pay back the success is to build up more places. There's community neighborhoods that people say, that's a great place to raise a kid. What makes a place a great place to raise a kid? Often, it's just a connection of the parents. So a resolution that I have is I want to make my neighborhood be a place where people say, that's a great place to raise a kid. And that's the sort of thing that's going to be a solution to this problem. And it involves overcoming the hyper-individualism that our society pulls us to. And on the political front, it involves overcoming the push towards centralization and bringing us towards a point where people actually believe that the American dream is not dead, but is still alive. On that hopeful note, thank you. Oh, whoops. I didn't mean to turn on that blue screen there. Microphones are coming around, so I'm happy to take any questions. Yes? Oh, you're the guy with the mic. Sorry, I should have prepped you guys to come up with a question. We've got one right here.
Okay, thank you. So,
the mic's there so everyone can hear you.
thank you. Hello, is it on?
Yes.
I can't hear it. Okay. With regard to, for example, large law firms that are always telling their clients how active they are out in the community because they get a bunch of associates to go out there and do work with Boys and Girls Clubs or some liberal organization. I mean,
Yeah.
people are thinking, I think, that they're doing a lot, and they're no doubt doing a lot. But what are your thoughts about those types of activities, organizations?
Yeah, if a law firm brought me in and said, hey, we want you to advise us on what we're encouraging our people to do in community involvement, I would say building up robust institutions that last, that people can count on. And that's a big part of it, is counting on it. When I do T-ball in my parish, my goal is to make it so that if it's springtime, and it should start in Lent. If it's Friday in Lent, you should always know where you can go and get a fish fry. So there's moms who are at home planning their week and meals. They should be Fridays off the board. It gives them something to count on. So reliable, repeated. I was saying earlier, one thing that makes college so great is that every day you see the same people who are engaged in the same undertaking, the same work that you are. And so that's the other part of it. The ideal institutions of civil society engage people in a common undertaking that is for a higher good that is outside of themselves. So that's why church is the most important. That's why in the elite neighborhoods that do really well, like Park Slope, where my brother lives in Brooklyn, everybody there is trying to make kids do better. And there's, a bit of a stereotype that they're like cutthroat and just care about their kids. And some of that's there, but I think that's exaggerated. People there are engaged in broadly a community that's doing it. So what I would say is look for alienated folk. Look for people who, especially parents who say, how do I raise my kids? And plug them into something that brings them together with other parents engaged in the same struggle and other parents maybe who are further advanced in age and that sort of thing. So bringing people together, reaching out to the alienated, and engaging them in a pursuit of a higher good are sort of the three things that I would look for.
Tim, thanks for being here. Thanks for a great talk. And thank you in describing your job earlier. I think you've given me an answer to the question, what would you like to do if you weren't doing what you do now? that was a great description of your daily work. The way in which you just responded to the question was very much in terms of kind of personal calling for each of us. Mm-hmm. On the order or level of policy for the Republican Party, mm-hmm. other than being against the incursion of big government into all the aspects of our life, what positive policies do you think the Republicans could bring forth to provide the kind of safety net and building up of community that you're advocating?
Well, I would emphasize that, yes, the first thing is it's like half of the 10 Commandments or thou shalt nots. Half of my solutions are what the government shouldn't do. And mostly they should stop trying to drive the church out of the public square. But for thou shalls, so labor unions are historically a really important institution of civil society for the working class and the middle class. In the United States and the United Kingdom, they've had a history of simply being combative, A, transactional, and B, combative with the businesses. There's parts in Northern Europe, there's a system called the Ghent system, and it's where a labor union is formed to provide unemployment insurance. So people join it for this sort of material, easily accessible good. But just like going to a diner every day, going to your Cap bar every day, you go there for coffee, right? But there's something more than the coffee that you get out of it. You join this union for the sake of the unemployment insurance, but these unions are geared towards training, towards providing support in extraordinary. A guy dies, they take care of the widow. And their interactions with their employers end up being more mutually beneficial because the employers say, if we want any good workers, the guys who are trained, the guys who are going to get in trouble with their union if they don't show up, those are the guys who belong to the union. So the unions want to, employers want to do business with the unions. So restoring private sector unions as an institution of civil society would require a total overhaul of our language, of our labor laws, which were founded in reaction to a very inhumane thing. Frederick Taylor was a guy who said, he was, in the times of Thomas Dewey, et cetera, said, well, we should just treat, I guess he was before then, but he said, any smart employer is just going to treat their workers just like they treat their machines, right? And so treating people like dirt, then you have that adverse. So that's one thing that I would do. I think local control of public schools is very important. I grew up in suburban New York where the town had control over the school. Now I live in Montgomery County. Montgomery County has a population, Maryland, 1.1 million people and just one Department of Education, one Board of Education. So we have no control over it. The thing, the sort of funny illustration of it is the snow days we get on days it doesn't snow. Because in the upper reaches of, you remember this, in the upper reaches of Montgomery County, there's like Gaithersburg or Damascus. And as far as I know, they are like in like Nunavut or the Northwest Territories of Canada. Because it'll be like 5 inches of snow, all of Montgomery County schools are canceled. Meanwhile, my kids are going outside in Silver Spring with like a light jacket on. And so that you get a snow day across the whole county, if in one part of it there's snow, is an illustration of what happens. County-wide decision-making, no local control. So I think state governments ought to return as much control to the local level as possible. What does that do? What makes a good public school is parental buy-in. So even in Montgomery County, not Langley, that's in Virginia, but the really nice public high schools and public elementary schools, et cetera, sort of the rules don't necessarily apply. The parents insert themselves. They inject some donated money. And they still have the nicest schools. So they're not even redistributing the wealth terribly well. They're just taking control away from the people. So the parents don't have control. The neighbors don't have control over it. And so it's just a place where you drop off your kids and then pick them up. So a public school is a great idea of a place that can be, and in some places is, a hub. I've got a few others. Again, my solutions, though, is what can we do to empower and liberate the people who are out there to do this on a local level? Yes?
In your research, did you examine any closely knit Catholic communities and their voting results and find any significant similarities or differences?
They don't really show up on the map. Trust me, I looked. But I come away with two things. One is, as a political analyst, the reason that the rural stuff showed up there more is because you're going to have a county that can be 50% with one particular religious tradition, the Calvinist Reformed. There aren't really, there isn't as much of that out there, because even if you're going to say 50% identify as Catholic, what matters for the good outcomes in religiosity is attendance. So however religious you are, one of the things Robert Putnam found is that, saying you believe a lot, praying a lot, even like following moral codes, that's following the moral codes is second to showing up to church in the importance of getting the good outcomes. So are there voting precincts where everybody is Catholic and goes to church? I couldn't find them on the map. I tried to find one over in Hyattsville. St. Jerome's is a great school and a great parish, but even there's a lot of commuters. So if anybody has an idea for where to look, I'll do it. But the sort of sad answer, in addition to the sort of analytical difficulty of it, is the Mormons are doing what we should be doing, and we're not doing it. I mean, the welfare state they have, where families give up a meal once a month, and then they calculate the amount of money they would have spent on that meal, and they donate it to their local parish of sorts. If you lose your job, they'll come and they say, okay, you'll spend down your savings in 3 weeks. If you don't have a job by then, you just show up at what they call the bishop's storehouse, and you just take stuff off the shelves for free, whatever your family needs. How is that paid for? By all of your neighbors giving up a meal. Think about that close, tight-knit stuff. They have cohesion. They have that. I mean, I'm not going to say in every place, but in the places I went, and statistically, the Mormon church, I when I was leaving Salt Lake City, I was like, do I need to go to confession for the sin of envy for how much they're doing what I think we should be doing? So if anybody can think they can point out to me a precinct or a county with a lot of Catholics who go to church, let me know. I didn't find it, and I didn't find the electoral things. A lot of bars, yes. No, in my own social circles in the primaries, all the men were voting for Ted Cruz and all the women were voting for Marco Rubio. And I have not analyzed what that meant, but yes, up front here.
Yeah, this is mainly a comment. I was so glad to see you tackle something that a lot of people, public commentators want, which is the sexual revolution, and how it's really, in a lot of ways, the source of a lot of the rot that's happened in the last half century. So if I have a question, it'd be, I'm not trying to make you give solutions, you don't do that, but suggestions for how individuals can show, especially to the people who grew up after it and have don't know that there was another way to live, the bankruptcy of this way of life. Of course, the bankruptcy is evident all around us.
But again, the irony is that if you go into Chevy Chase, you will find most parents try to get their kids to not sleep around in high school. You will find that most parents have imbued the idea that you shouldn't have multiple sexual partners, a ton of them over the course of your life. You won't find Catholic Christian teaching, but you'll find stuff that pushes pretty close in that direction. And then that marriage, you should at least try to make it be a lifelong commitment, and it should be monogamous. So why do they do this? Because it's best practices. I mean, there's some way you could think of ethics as nothing better than sort of a very long-term best practices, but that people are happier when they follow these certain set of rules. Now, of course, you'll never get anybody in the media to preach that message. They'll say, well, that would be preachy, that's moralistic. Yes, what I choose is a monogamous relationship with my wife where we're very involved in our kids' lives, but I'm not going to say that that's right for everybody. So I don't think it's as hard a lift as we sometimes think it is, in part because what was worried about with the spread of divorce, even in Humanae Vitae, what was warned of, is coming into fruition. Obviously, we didn't do a good job of persuading people that this was wrong ahead of time, even with the warnings. But with the warnings coming to fruition, it might be easier. Obviously, I think new and better ways of talking about it are needed. Not my area of expertise. But what I have learned is that certainly the data show that that a lot of what was reaped by the sexual revolution has very clear consequences negative consequences that nobody can deny right now. Any more questions? Yes.
I don't even know if this needs a mic for this one, but in places like Chevy Chase, I'm assuming that the good outcomes do not correlate as strongly with church attendance as they do in other places. Is that right? That the elite circles, the church is not as central.
Well, first of all, the elites, the wealthier people do go to church more. If you I'm not talking about like the 1% of the 1%, though Mark Wahlberg and Kanye West both do. So it's actually going to be really interesting when all the like pop media stars are like church-going family people in a couple of years. But if you just go by the quintile, so divide income, the America into 5, church population climbs as you go up. But yes, in a secularizing country, the elites have other options. They drop out of church because it interferes with their favorite yoga class. Okay, that's sort of an obnoxious way to put it. It's also probably a little bit true. When the middle class and working class say, "Hey, people are dropping out of church," they don't replace it with a soccer league, a yoga class, a professional association, or that sort of thing. A lot of what it gets replaced with is TV. And I think that leads to the dissolution of the families. But you're right. Secularization, if you think of it as a storm, it's one that the elites are buffeted against by the other institutions that stand around them like a grove. So they don't see, oh, well, these people stopped going to church and they did poorly. They see, oh, these people stopped going to church, and now they're able to volunteer gardening at Village Hall every Sunday. And so that's one reason why I try hard to drive this home, even if you had a bad experience, with your growing up and your parents were overbearing, etc. If you are pushing secularization, you are not loving the working class in America, because it's not at all immediately obvious to them for the reason you point out. Yes.
I was trying to do your two sides of the coin question also while you were talking about how Orange City, Iowa, and I'm from Iowa originally, by the way. So,
Where?
Grinnell, Iowa.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Far north of Grinnell, Iowa, but not anything to do with Grinnell College. But two sides of the coin again. And I was wondering if it's partly about individual truth and individual morality as compared to collective. For example, to an evangelical Christian, I hung out with both sides of that coin. I'm an evangelical Christian, go to church every Sunday, involved in my church, but also I'm hanging out with the private equity people who own the companies and everything, and they both didn't like Trump. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Well, to the private equity people, truth mattered on an individual micro level, right? And I voted for him, so I can bash him. He's a BSer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Truth is not important to him, but the outcome, the macro outcome, is where you want to go. Truth is important to the smart people, but also truth is important to religious people on a micro level. Even if you're saving the earth or doing something big like a liberal wants to do, if you're dishonest on an individual level, if you're not engaged with truth, you're not doing right.
You're probably better than I am at citing the specific verse. As an evangelical, you have it more memorized. But he who is dishonest in small things will be, yes. Yes. I can paraphrase the Bible very well.
The right outcome at the macro level, even if
Yes.
he's doing the right thing,
Yep.
what he's doing at the individual level matters.
Yeah. No, feeling that the ends justify the means is not something that we're as willing to sign up for. But again, I think the most important thing was the articulation that the American dream is dead didn't resonate, and then the need for a big, massive solution, a strongman type figure, didn't resonate in some of those things. And again, that calculation gets wiped out once it's just two of them up there, and there's a whole different question. So I basically spend zero time on the general election in my book, except sometimes comparing Trump to Romney, but never comparing Trump to Hillary, really, because that's too much of a distraction. But on the people who came out of the woodwork for him, I think that told us a story. And some people said, oh, well, Trump supporters are, look at the data, and they're just as rich, Trump's original early core support. They're richer than the average American, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of studies backed up that idea that there was no suffering in real Trump country. Again, not the 50% of the country that voted for him, but the 15 that really came out for him right away. No suffering among these people. A lot of them said, actually, where there's more unemployment, you get more Trump. More men dropping out of the labor force, you get more Trump in these early primaries. More opioids, you get more Trump. So what was it? The first class looked at individuals. The people who were rallying to him early on were not the people who were necessarily suffering the most. The places that were suffering were the places where the people who voted said, the American dream is dead. They were the guys who grew up with the Memorial Day parade going right down through Main Street, and now there was nothing on Main Street and people didn't know their neighbors. Those were the people who said, yep, the American dream is dead, and maybe a real powerful, strong man who's going to kick the butt of my enemies is the one who's going to fix it. I think I have time for one more question. We wrap up. I'll take two.
Okay. What you recommended to us is to continue investing in these institutions. And generally, I imagine people in this room came out of groups that had those strong families and strong institutions. Do you have a recommendation or idea for a way to reach the people who have already been alienated?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the difference, Robert Nisbet offered a alienation that I used throughout the book. And he says, alienation is a state of being detached from society and not seeing the purpose of being attached to society. So that makes the question you're asking very vexing, because you're trying to tell people, no, actually, you can't just throw e-commerce and your TV and a little bit of Social Security disability get through life. You have to go out and engage. And it's hard to see that. So, think like Jesus does and feed people. That's one thing. Like, people like food. Say, hey, come on, community potluck or whatever. And again, the Mormons do that very well. Providing immediate needs or wants, and as part of building connection, is the way that I would think about going about that. And so, what is it that I try to do in my parish? I was telling Dr. Hansen earlier, one of the greatest needs in a suburban place like ours is a place where parents can bring their children and ignore them while they then socialize with other adults. And the kids are still safe. And so that's something to provide for people. So that general framework is what I would think of. So you get the final.
Right. Two things. One is, in a way, your discussion of economic factors is pretty muted. And I suspect that one thing some people might argue in response to you is that there's a question about the arrow of causation. How much is that the disconnecting in community is causing the economic problems of the alienation?
Yeah.
How much is it, on the other hand, that the economic problems is what's causing the disconnecting? And generally, political liberals will emphasize the economic factors more and emphasize the need for government programs to provide that. So that's the first question. The second question is, how much is this associated with urbanization? That, making connections, and there's an irony in the fact that in large urban areas, connections might be harder to make in some way.
Bringing people
than
physically
the rural
close
areas.
doesn't always. Yeah.
Because people tend to get more atomized and on their own in those areas. And so, how much of this is an urbanization problem, and how is it possible to encourage community connections in more densely populated urban and suburban areas?
I'll answer the second one first quickly. It's easier to, in some ways, to turn around urban areas because people are physically close and there are institutions you can plug into. I think that the urban story is primarily when family falls apart, community falls apart. I think the causality goes both ways, as I was arguing, but I think the urban story is largely one about family falling apart and causing community to fall apart. But I also think that it depends on what sort of urban area it is. I mean, where I grew up, Washington Square Park was out there, and we would just run around. We knew other people. My mom met other parents at the playground, etc. That was a neighborhood built around a park, and the people there so cars couldn't drive through there in the 70s, right before we moved to that neighborhood, and that's the sort of thing that makes it strong. But on the economics and the culture, it certainly goes both ways. And in the book, I focus a lot more on the economics. So chapters 2 through 5 is sort of a story of the factories in Western Michigan closing down that leads to the Uniontown thing. I emphasize the cultural because I think that gets omitted too much. In other words, a factory closing down is the first domino. And then the coffee shop that serves the factory closes down because the men aren't there anymore. So people have fewer places to meet. Some parents who are really involved in their kids' lives pull their kids out of that public school and move somewhere else. So that public school becomes less of a great public school. People stop going to church, the church closes, there's less hubs, people's lives fall apart. But the alternative story to that first domino falling doesn't knock everything over. It depends on the robustness of what's after that first domino. And so I compare Uniontown, which was pretty thin. It had a handful of Catholic parishes, but one Protestant church, and it didn't have that many other institutions or that many churches because it just had a smaller population. Compare that to Pittsburgh. Both of them get destroyed by the death of steel and the death of coal. But in Pittsburgh, everybody points to how these industrialists had built up museums and schools and that sort of thing, and said, okay, well, those were pumping money into the town. But it wasn't just pumping money. Employing people is also giving them an institution of civil society, but it's also the libraries and those things that provided meeting grounds, and there was more places for people to connect and to have the human level safety net and to have the sense of purpose and to have a way to be occupied. So imagine an employer coming back to Western Michigan 20 years after the factory's closed down, Western Pennsylvania, and saying, okay, now I know there's a lot of available workers out here because of this industry. Let's look in Pittsburgh. Great, a lot of workers. Let's go down the river a little bit and look in Uniontown. People's lives have fallen apart. Drugs are all over the place. The women are trying to raise children without a father. You're saying if this father can't stick with his kid, is he going to be a good worker? So that's how the community strength affects the economic strength. And that's still a bit of a hypothesis. That's not something I've rigorously tested or anything. That's sort of my next research project. So I'm going to thank you for asking it, and thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody.